What does racism mean to you? Or how would you define racism?
Mm-hmm. I've come to understand race as an arbitrary factor by which power, wealth, and credibility are afforded. And I see it the way it works as like erecting barriers constantly in front of people, and as you were saying, interpersonally and institutionally. And I see it as being completely arbitrary. Sometimes it's intentional and sometimes it's unintentional, but operating on a subconscious realm.
So how do you think, when people express their understandings of racism as solely being only those, people who, use racial slurs and violence
Mm-hmm.
towards people of another race, how do you what do you think of that?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really narrow understanding of what racism is in terms of looking at the external. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's such an important exercise to look at the internal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I mean, as we were talking about before, like the idea that I have been socialized in a racist society that has racist institutions. So, because of that, I have thoughts and feelings that are tied to the racism that exists in the context around me. And then that leads me to think certain things, make assumptions, certain assumptions, react in certain ways that I may not be conscious of, right? And so much is going on internally that I need to pay attention to. And as we talk about, like, start to deconstruct once we become aware of those things,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I
it's,
always
yeah.
wonder, right? Like, was it deliberate? Like, am I being like, oh, am I,
Yeah.
you know, was it really deliberate? Like, did it happen piece by piece by piece that our institutions are actually so
Mm-hmm.
institutionalized in their systemic racism? Or
Mm-hmm.
was it calculated and deliberate? Like, it was done from the beginning to be like this? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know sometimes. Like, I wonder.
It's a really interesting chicken
Yeah.
and egg debate.
Yeah.
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 And it might not follow along the same thing, but we'll just see where it goes. The
Sure.
second question is,
Yeah.
how have you experienced racism? And like I said, in your case, it would be, how have you witnessed racism?
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
I'm sure that you have seen a lot, like in day to
Yes.
day, witnessing of racism, even just looking
Mm-hmm.
out the front door onto 20th Street of your office.
Absolutely.
But even in a conceptual sense. So if you can maybe talk a little bit about
Mm.
both
Sure.
for a second, if you know what I mean.
What do you mean by the conceptual sense?
Well, because like we were just talking
Mm-hmm.
about, like, I mean, there's concepts of empathy and charity, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
actual, the concept of justice,
Yeah.
and humanity. And
Mm-hmm.
what are the difference?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I mean, those are
Okay.
very conceptual, kind of
Yeah.
theoretical,
Yeah. Okay.
things,
Yeah.
right? And
Sure.
then, but we also, witness
Mm-hmm.
every day,
Mm-hmm.
racism walking down the street,
Yeah.
right?
Sure.
Yeah. So you
Well.
just maybe mention.
Sure. The way I observe racism in the world is typically through barriers that are thrown up in front of people, people who aren't afforded certain opportunities because of their race. So we see this a lot in housing. If someone is visibly Indigenous or has an Indigenous accent, they're told that the apartment is taken, right? Whereas the very next person who is visibly non-Aboriginal or doesn't have an accent, suddenly there's availability, right? It's as easy, it's as simple as that, an opportunity that is not afforded to someone on the basis of their race. We see discrimination in the workplace. We see this discrimination in so many different spheres, the provision of public services or other forms of service. We see, again, opportunities that aren't afforded to people because of their race, and just like differential treatment. We see that. In the courts, we see it all the time, and I know that the judges would be defensive about this, but we see assumptions being made on the basis of someone's race, their background, the way that they speak, the way they present themselves. All of these arbitrary factors. There's assessments of credibility that are made on that basis, and that's how I see racism.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see it on the street, absolutely. But I think that interestingly, when I think about racism on the street, I do think about that conceptual piece because I see individuals who don't afford that sense of respect or dignity to the person who's passing them on the street.
Mm-hmm.
Like they'll ignore them or look through them or just like look over them in this superior sense. And I also see the person who's walking towards them on the street, receiving a message about their worthiness based on how that person is. treating them.
Yeah,
Does that make sense? So
yeah.
that speaks to a conceptual piece to me in terms of, are we looking at each other as equals and seeing the humanity and dignity in the other person?
Yeah.
I pass you in the street, I want to look you in the eye.
Well, and I
"Good
like what
morning."
you say. Yeah, I do my best to try and actually acknowledge, people that you meet and see.
Mhm.
And we need to work more, more away from a world of charity and more towards a world of justice.
Yeah. So in a world of charity, like I'm looking at someone and saying, I see that you have a disadvantage or disadvantaged circumstances, and I have pity for you,
Yeah.
and I want to, give you something because I have these privileges and I have these advantages. So I want to try to be helping you. Whereas a justice approach, a justice-oriented approach, is more saying like, because of these systemic inequities, you have the circumstances you do. I'm in the circumstances that I'm in. Let's stand together and be working together towards a just world and seeing each other as equals as we do that.
That is, I am the bridge to ending racism in Saskatoon. How would you finish that? Or if you were to try, what are your thoughts on trying to assist people in understanding, or teaching people about racism? So if I am the bridge to ending racism in Saskatoon.
Well, I sort of said what I guess I said earlier about like by recognizing the racist within, by understanding that I'm socialized in a racist society and that this exists within me, and like coming to understand it, grappling with it, deconstructing it, is a way, I think, to be like building that bridge. I also believe in the importance of relationship because I think empathy is such an important tool. How do I cultivate empathy, right, about someone who's had a different journey other than building a relationship with that person, right? Hearing them, understanding them. So I think that is how we build bridges, actually, is through relationship. And that's also, but that's like the basics of just like love your neighbor, like just get to know them, recognize who your neighbor is. It's not necessarily the person who looks like you and lives in your zip code and went to the same school that you went to, right? It's actually all the people around you. So get to know your neighbor.